I stood in front of the cave and checked my pack one last time, just to make sure that everything that I needed was in there. Rope, a blade, food and water, an emergency kit, and plenty of flares. I had packed an emergency beacon as well. The beacon was actually a prototype. It linked up directly to the office. If I was in distress and pushed it, my vitals would be sent along with my general location. The band around my wrist monitored my heart rate, and if anything was to happen, they knew whether they were looking for me, or just my remains. Isn't that a fun thought? I never actually pushed it. If I ever needed it, Simon, who works on all the technology, told me that I should be prepared to endure some pretty serious stimuli. I really wish that guy would just be clear with me sometimes. I didn't just explore the caves for the immense joy that I found in them. This was also what I did for work. My job was to go in and follow the map, making sure that everything was all right for either using it for tourism or mining, depending on the decision our clients made, of course. The Brighton Caverns were to be advertised as unlike any other caving experience available for exploration. That was pretty high praise, considering how wonderful of an experience most of the caves that I ended up in were. It was a way to be closer to nature in a way that was uncommon. My first experience in a cave was an accident when I was only 7 years old. I had been staying at a friend's house while my parents were out of town and had gotten bored with the endless hours of television that we were consuming. So I took a stroll. The memories that stayed from that day shaped the person that I eventually grew up to be. Never have I felt as close to nature as I did in those moments, and my life has been about chasing that feeling down one more time. Then there was my first cave. It was down on the beach, forced into a corner that you wouldn't notice unless you knew where to look. You had to pass through a thick set of reeds to even get to the entrance. I remember wandering through them and staring at the sky through their gentle sway. I remember feeling truly lost in that moment, and that feeling was like nothing else that I ever experienced. The cave itself was nothing extraordinary in retrospect, but in that moment, it was everything I ever needed. It was like the joy of holding a small rock in the palm of your hand, but reversed. It was an embrace from nature that chilled you to the core, but still sheltered you. It was a small cave, more of an opening really, and it extended only about 50 yards deep, but it may as well have been miles. The darkness, true darkness, that was at the back of that cave, was unlike any that I had ever known up until that point in my life. A small search party found me nearly 10 hours later. It was impossible to hear their voices from inside the cave. The wind that came in from the sea was enough to simply drown it all away, much like the fan that nature provided. It had been so relaxing that I had fallen asleep, and that was how they found me. A faint smile crossed my lips as I stuffed all of my gear back into my bag while recalling those younger years of my life. My parents had gotten so fed up with how caves had become the most incredible thing to me, they thought it was like an insane form of Stockholm Syndrome. It didn't matter, I had found my true calling. I secured my pack and did a few minutes of breathing in and out to enjoy the fresh oxygen before I started. Almost immediately, you can taste the difference. It can leave a funny taste in your mouth over time if you aren't prepared, but, thankfully, I had mints on hand if I needed them. My gear was set, and I was good to go. I had the entire day but was hoping to be done in a few hours tops. There were some errands that I wouldn't mind getting to if I finished up early. I hit the timer on my watch and got started. I took my first few steps inside and immediately felt the comfort that only a cave could provide. It was like being surrounded by memories, nostalgia, and a sense of adventure all at the same time. A cave was a mystery that might never be solved, but it was always there to be explored. It was a little warmer than I expected. When I cracked a glow stick that shone bright blue, it would hold for about 4 hours. It made the cave vibrant, and the glow was comforting as I began the inspection. It was always a good idea to drop them every 100 yards or so. The first thing that I decided to check for was tracks. We needed to know if there were any local wildlife using this place for shelter. A few of the smaller critters wouldn't be a problem, but if there was anything bigger like bears or wolves, it was best to mark it then and maybe come back better prepared. I had only ever stumbled into an occupied cave once, and it was not a mistake that I planned on making ever again. The wolf that was in there looked at me like I was a rack of ribs. The only reason that I got out of there was because the wolf had been just as startled as I was. If there was anything in here, it had been there for a while, so it shouldn't be too much of an issue. The light on my helmet illuminated the cave in a bright white glow, and I began to venture forth. There was nothing extraordinary about the first few feet into the cave. It was just a standard cave as far as I could tell. The rock formation seemed to be in order and didn't seem to be in any danger of cave-in. I took the glove off my left hand and let it rest on the rock for a moment. It was like the feeling of collecting your favorite rock multiplied tenfold. I never felt as close to nature as when I was in a cave. I slipped the glove back on after a few minutes and carried on, but not before cracking another glow stick. I made my way further in and listened for the sound of water. The initial report that my company had received stated that there was a naturally occurring source of water here. We would need a sample of that to ensure that it wasn't carrying anything dangerous. It was a quiet cave, with the sound of my footsteps being the only noise. I checked my watch. Wait, that can't be right? 6 hours? I just started. The timer on my watch ticked upwards, showing just over 360 minutes. That can't be right. I was still just by the entrance. 6 hours. That means the glow sticks have already gone out. But I swear that it was only a minute ago. Not even. The memory was fresh in my mind, and the more I thought about it, the more recently I was sure it had happened. I turned to double check and saw only darkness. Okay, that's not necessarily a problem. The watch must have been on the fritz, and perhaps I simply walked further than I had thought. I took the watch off and slipped it into my jacket pocket. I would have to get it checked out later. It was a pretty expensive piece of equipment. As for the flares, I don't know. Maybe I had wandered farther than I thought. The temperature in the cave was hotter than I expected. There was perspiration building on my forehead, and I could feel it beginning to build up underneath my clothes. I dropped my pack onto the floor and took off my jacket, slipping it into my pack. A t-shirt wasn't my preferred outfit for exploration, but something told me that this heat was only going to get worse. Strange. Usually the caves averaged a much cooler temperature than outside, and it had been a little warm when I came in, but this was ridiculous. It was the middle of winter, after all, and this kind of heat shouldn't be present. I stood up and then realized that I wasn't sure which way I had just been going. That was odd, because I usually had a fantastic sense of direction. Okay, no need to panic. I have been in dozens of caves and even got lost once or twice. It was never a big deal, you just picked a direction and moved forward. Usually, there was a little more to go on, and it always seemed like it was going to be okay. Brighton Cave seemed to be built differently, however. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone here. Fear should have been the last thing on my mind. Panicking was not a good idea. I needed to keep a clear head on my shoulders. It couldn't get much worse than this. I'm just a little lost, that's all. It was going to be okay, just breathe. Remember that you have to breathe. Then my light went out on my helmet. It was sudden, and there was no warning. It didn't blink, it didn't flash. Suddenly, there was nothing but complete and total darkness enveloping me. If ever there was an emergency, it was then. I needed that beacon. I reached into my pack with trembling hands and began to rifle through it. I pulled out the jacket I had just shoved in there, the food, the water, everything. It had to be here. It was in a small case about 6 inches wide. I had packed it. I was sure of it. I felt it in my hand and instantly embraced a shockwave of relief that surged throughout my body. There was an audible sigh that escaped from my mouth, but I soon found that feeling of salvation to be short-lived. There was a sharp pain across my wrist, as if it had been struck with a stick, and I let out a yelp of surprised pain. The device flew from my hands, and I heard it land far off in the distance. The panic attack started immediately. I wasn't alone there. That had been real. I was sure of it. There was no presence, the pain was familiar, it had been a blunt object, and it was in the same reality as mine. Then I heard them. There were drums in the deep. Their vibrations surged and built from the cave floor. With each strike, they grew louder and more pronounced. I felt them rattling my bones inside my skin, and my flesh crawled. I began to hyperventilate, and the sound of my breathing intertwined with the drums. Both sounds echoed throughout the cave. I collapsed onto my back and felt my body go rigid. Suddenly, my jaw clenched with such a force that my teeth hurt. I started to breathe too fast, and now suddenly I was cut off. I struggled to get air through my nose alone, and it simply wasn't enough. There was the smallest bit passing through my clenched teeth, but it was so little. My mind jumbled information until my thoughts were no longer even coherent. I was no longer able to process words or the sound of my own conscience. There was nothing in my mind besides a bright red that came to me as a blinding light. I could actually feel my pupils dilate as they comprehended the light change that wasn't there. I began to shake and my teeth began to grind together. I needed to get out of there, but I couldn't even move. There was no more familiarity with this cave or any of its kind. Gone was every pleasant memory that I had ever had of any cave. Terror was now the only feeling with which I was remotely acquainted. My senses were completely overwhelmed. The drums beat fiercely. The darkness embraced me. The red had begun to flash in my mind, and I am pretty sure that I had begun to drool. There were tears in my eyes as I had even forgotten how to blink. There was another sound, a scraping sound. I tried to look around, but none of my body was responsive to any command that I was issuing. It was faint, but it was there. It was real, I knew it, it wasn't in my head. I rolled my eyes upwards as hard as I could, struggling to see. That's when I noticed what exactly was happening to me. The scraping. It was me. I was being dragged. Something or someone was pulling me down this cave. It moved in a rhythm with the drums. They beat louder and harder, then just a little faster. As they did, so did whatever was pulling me. Reaching out and plucking me as if I was fruit. Descending on me as if I was nothing more than prey. I wanted to just be able to accept it. To let it, or him, or this fucking cave, whatever it was that was behind this, just end it. I wanted the unbelievable panic that had now enveloped my entire sense of self to let me go. That's when I felt it. I almost gasped as I realized that my body had recognized a feeling in my fingers. I clenched downwards as hard as I could and could have wept once I realized what it was I now had in my possession. The beacon was now clenched firmly in my hand. It needed to be activated. Turned on. It needed to be turned on. I couldn't remember how. The feeling of frustration made me wish I could make any sound at all. Simon had told me, and he had been adamant that I pay attention. It was simple, just open the box and push the button. That's it. I could do this. I held the box. I just needed to get it open. It was such a simple task that it almost seemed impossible. I screamed as the drums drowned out the sound. It took every bit of willpower that I had, but I had grabbed the box, and I had screamed. My body was in some of my control. There was a chance. I managed to muster up enough control to toss my body upwards from the left, right at my shoulders. The maneuver ended up with my hand directly on the other. I pulled the box open with my left hand and hit the button with my right thumb. A violent blue light shot out from the box and illuminated all around me. I should have felt relieved, but that moment was torn from me as I comprehended my surroundings. I had never been in a more open place in my life. There was no ceiling or floor, nor were there any walls. I should have been falling. There was nothing around me for miles in any direction, and it was all perfectly illuminated. My eyes bulged in wonder as I comprehended a different world. This was nowhere on Earth, I was sure of it. Then I saw it. For a second, I laid eyes on what it was that was dragging me, but only for a second. The creature stood as tall as two men and had scaled skin that was tinted blue and black. It had two eyes on its face that glowed red and showed surprise at being witnessed. It was as tall as it was, even when it was hunched down. I could only imagine how tall it would be if it stretched to its full height. There was heat emanating off of it. That's why it had been so warm in the cave. This thing was stalking me from the very beginning. At the same time, it opened its mouth in a silent scream that was louder than anything I had ever heard. The noise pierced my mind like a needle, and I almost passed out from the pain. Then, just like that, it was gone. The next time I opened my eyes was a week later. I was in a well-lit room with a bed and the sound of machinery. It turned out to be a hospital, but at the time, I couldn't comprehend that. Simon was actually the one who debriefed me later on in that very same room. He told me that the company received the distress signal not even a few minutes after I had supposedly entered the cave. They received the signal, but that's it. They somehow couldn't monitor my vitals. They figured it was a fluke and sent a team down anyway. They said Brighton Caves was only a few hundred yards deep, and they scoured it top to bottom, and I was nowhere in sight. It was a small cave, and there was no disturbance that they could spot. 3 days later, my vitals showed up on their equipment. My heart rate was so fast that it should have exploded. The team was still camping in the area and running a search and rescue through the woods when they found me at the mouth of the cave. I was naked and covered in what was described to me as a tar-like black substance. I had lost approximately 10 kilograms and was in the middle of a seizure. By the time I reached the hospital, I was no longer responsive. A coma is what they told me. They couldn't do anything but wait. They told me I was lucky to have woken up after whatever the hell it was that had happened to me. I still work for the same company, but I don't do field work anymore. I'm not sure if I'll ever be able to step foot in a cave again. I spend most of my time now in the office going through other explorers' reports, as well as looking over charts. They offered me a trauma package that would ensure that I would basically never have to work again, but they were clearly scared of some kind of lawsuit. I was nothing but grateful to them, though. Whatever it was that happened to me down there was out of anyone's control. I still see that thing when I try to sleep at night. Also, if I ever get a little too warm in an enclosed area, I start to have breathing issues. My therapist says that it should get easier as time passes, but we'll see. At the end of the day, I'm just grateful to be alive.